It's great to be able to be with you for the second of these talks. If you weren't with us yesterday, we were talking about is belief in God irrational? This one is about suffering. Tomorrow we'll be looking at the question, is Jesus simply the God of the West? And on the last day, we'll be looking at issues of exclusivism and how can anyone claim to know or have the only way. But this particular question is a huge one. It gets asked in so many different ways. It was that very profound philosopher, Woody Allen, who said, "How do you expect me to believe in God when only last week I got my tongue caught in the roller of my electric typewriter?" And if that expresses the problem of suffering at one level, at its most minimal, then we have it also at another level where we're not just simply asking why is the world like this, we're asking why me? And it is very difficult in a compressed period of time to do full justice to every single aspect of this question. So here's what I'll do. There are a series of books being written by various colleagues of mine that look at this issue of suffering from different perspectives. And if you are particularly interested in an aspect of it, then if you come to me at the end with one of the home postcards that you can see on your table, and you just give me an email address and just talk with me briefly about which aspect you're interested in, then I will arrange for you, completely free of charge, to be given one of those resources for you to read. So one of my colleagues, Sharon Dirks, she did her doctorate at Cambridge University. She was very much interested in looking at people in permanent vegetative states. And she was involved in some pioneering research where they were asking people to imagine hitting a ball over a net in order to respond yes to certain questions, and discovered that some people who they thought were in this state actually weren't. They could communicate to the outside world if you knew how to tap into it. She's written a book on suffering which got very well reviewed by all kinds of people around the world, including many non-Christians. Another colleague of mine, Vince Vitale, we sometimes call him Dr. Death, he did his doctorate here at Oxford. It's about to be published through OUP. He's written a more popular level book with my boss, actually, Ravi Zacharias, also on suffering, looking at it from a strongly philosophical angle. There are just so many other books, and I'll be happy to make them available to you. In particular, another person who I have the joy of working with, Professor John Lennox, who's a professor of mathematics here, he spoke in New Zealand shortly after the earthquake that you may remember from a couple of years ago, right in the epicenter, which suffered the largest amount of damage, where he was asked to speak to this from the subject of natural disasters and so on. So if you come and say, look, actually, this is something I'm really interested in, you can have it for free, if you are a non-Christian. Okay, so if you're a visitor here, you're not a Christian, I will give you a free resource. Now, you may be sat here as a Christian thinking this isn't fair. I want to have a free resource. And you're thinking about having a momentary crisis of conscience and faith, and maybe momentarily suspending your belief as a Christian, so you can come to me and say, well, look, I'm not a Christian right now, but I would like one of these free things too. And I would like to say to you, if that's what you're thinking of doing, there will be a day of judgment in this world, and you will be held to account. So I make that offer right at the very beginning. So if there are a particular aspect of this or multiple that you really would like to read about more, come and speak to me. We'd like to help in any way we can. But this is also a very personal issue too. At the age of 14, I was in a boarding school. My parents were living in the Middle East at the time. I was in Saudi Arabia. I was for a few years at a boarding school over here for my education. And I fell very seriously ill. I ended up in hospital for about almost 2 months. I was in a small ward, 14 people. On average, one person died on that ward every day. I was being given 4 injections every 6 hours. I was put in traction. I couldn't walk. I had no movement in the lower part of my body. The doctors could see there was something seriously wrong for my white blood cell count. I was clearly fighting off something. They just couldn't figure out what it was. And then eventually, when all of the veins collapsed in my arms, they couldn't even get the needles in anymore to administer the drugs. That's when things started to look very, very serious. I can remember, my parents coming over, and then there was this big question about, where was all of this going? And I know in the middle of that, if someone came to me and said, let me try to give you, a biblical framework to understand why there might be so suffering in this world, I may not have appreciated it and welcomed it. So what I am going to try and do is give you that framework, knowing there are going to be lots of holes, gaps, but there is the opportunity for conversation. As I'm happy to stay around and try and answer any other questions, because I'm going to have to cover much ground in order to create that framework. We're going to have to skip a little bit in various times. Please do bear with me. If I start speaking so quickly that it feels like I'm no longer speaking in English, if someone waves at me, I'll remember to breathe. That has the effect of slowing down my delivery. it might make what I'm saying more understandable. But let me start with this. When we talk about why does a God of love, if we have a God of love, why is there so much suffering in this world? The problem really only exists if the word love is operative. Does that make sense? If you have a God who is indifferent or evil, there is no problem with seeing evil and suffering in this world. And if love isn't important or necessary in any kind of way, then we don't have a problem. So very often when we start talking about this problem, we jump in at the suffering end, and what I want to do is just take a couple of moments just to focus more on the love end. Because if you ask the question, what does it mean to create a world in which love is capable of meaningful expression and experience, you suddenly start to find you run into some very interesting questions. Because the idea of a lifeless love or a loveless life is a terrifying thought to most of us. And so we ask, what does it mean to live in a world in which love is capable of meaningful expression and experience? What kind of world would God create to make that possible? And it's at this point we start to see various things come in. For example, what we first of all realize is, well, love is a quality that exists between personal beings. You need two personal beings normally to express and experience love. Now, I know sometimes, you might see men, possibly with gel in their hair, combing their hair, looking in the mirror, going, I'm in love. That sometimes happens in the gym I go to. You can see it in the mirror. Or they might talk about, I love my car. But this is sad. The relationship between you and an object, for example, is different between you and a person. The relationship between you and an object is one of consumption. We consume objects for our own pleasure. But the relationship between you and another person is one of connection. Now, this is one of the reasons why, in a world which is now so dominated by sexual imagery and porn and so on, a lot of people feel often hurt or misunderstood. We're reducing people into objects which we consume for our own pleasure and are working off a consumption model. Whereas actually the true nature of love is to make a relational connection and actually talk with them. And this is actually very, very important if you want to think about what it means to be in a loving world. Some of you may have seen me talking with the guy who's giving all the talks in the evening, Stephen Foster, who's brilliant delivery. And if you weren't here last night, do go online and watch what he had to say. And you may have seen us talking and figured out we've known each other for a while. And you might come to me and say, Michael, you and Stephen obviously know each other. Are you enjoying doing this week with him? If I were to say to you, yeah, he's using me. If that was my response to your question, you would understand I'd said something very serious. Does that make sense? Seriously wrong. How could he use me? Because objects get used for your own purpose. But you don't use people. With people, we're looking for connection. And so we're living in a world right now where we so often reduce other people into objects, and we think of it that way. We put ourselves in the middle. It's very narcissistic. We're consuming everything and everyone around us for our own pleasure, and we're wondering at times why we get so hurt in the process. So first of all, we have to understand that there is a relational dynamic to love. It exists between two personal beings. And if you want that to be real, you're also therefore talking about a set of moral frameworks and commitments that actually make this real. Now, I know we often think that somehow morality or moral thinking may be in conflict to love, but that's because we don't think of love in terms of commitment. I can remember before I got married, talking to my father-in-law, and he said words to the effect of me like, gosh, I love my wife so much more now, than I did when we first got married. It was something like that. And I can remember thinking, there must be something wrong with you. Because the intensity of feeling I feel right now, the desire, the longing, there's no way I can you can't go up from here. In my sense, I'm at 10. Maybe you got married at like 2. You're like lukewarm, slightly indifferent, and somehow you've warmed up over the years. But right now, I feel like this is an incandescent flame. And there's no way you can go up from here. Does that make sense? It was the intensity, the experience was just so overpoweringly strong. Well, I've been married now coming up for 24 years, and now I know exactly what he means by that. There's an intensity in the relationship and the love and a depth that simply wasn't there before. It wasn't capable, and it comes through a process of commitment. All meaningful relationship results in commitment. Your friends are people you're committed to. You're there even when it's not convenient, even when it is difficult, even when no matter what they're going through, you are there. You make a process of commitment to them, which is why in Christian marriage ceremonies around the world for 2 millennia, and I don't know how Hollywood managed to change the words, but Hollywood have, because every time you watch a movie, people say, I do. But that has never been part of any form of Christian liturgy in any denomination. When we get married, we don't ask the question, do you take this person to be your husband, your wife, whatever? And the response is not I do, which is a statement of fact. The question is, will you take this person? It's a question of the will, and the response is, I will. It's a commitment of intent of the will, and it is morally governed. If you violate that moral framework, then you've betrayed them, you've let them down. And actually, that is a huge deal. Now, not only that, if you want to have a world in which love is capable of meaningful expression and experience, you don't just simply need these moral frameworks of commitment that actually make it possible and protect and preserve our relationships. You don't just simply need to understand the fact that we have other people around us. We also have choices which we make. When Henry Ford very famously said, look, you can choose any color car you want so long as it is black, the reason why some people thought that was funny, obviously not this audience, is he's employing a language of choice. You can have any color you want, and you can have a black one, or a black one. What would you like? You go, black. You see, it's one thing to employ the language of choice. It's quite something else to actually offer it. I mean, we get confused on this, especially again when we think about love, because sometimes we say very meaningless things like, even if you were the last person in the world, I'd still love you. Ever heard someone say that? Ever thought how meaningless it is? If you were the last person in the world, I'd have no option but to love you. Love only exists between personal beings. What would be much more meaningful to say, if there were twice as many people in the universe as there are right now, I would still, you would still be the one for me. Now that's meaningful. Does that make sense? If I multiply the number of options, I'm committed to you. So we need to take a time and just step back and think, what does it look like? If a loving God wants to create a loving world, what are the things that get built into it? And that is precisely the biblical narrative. A loving God does create a loving world. He puts personal beings in it who can experience and express it. He gives a moral framework by which we can make commitments and be bound to one another. He puts in place all kinds of other things, and he gives us the capacity to make various choices, which makes all of this real. Now, you don't need to be particularly astute to look around the world and say, well, there seems to be an awful lot that's gone wrong. Because clearly there has. So now the question comes, well, what on earth is going on there? And this is where we need to then to think about one last element of this before I go into the framework that I want to try and share with you, and it's this. We often talk about free love and love being free, and we value our freedom. But we have to think about that word freedom very carefully. Freedom is not doing whatever you want, however you want, whenever you want to. That is not freedom. That is anarchy. And when anarchy breaks out in a society, you don't experience an increase of the amount of freedom that you have, you experience the loss of it. And there are parts of the world which I travel to almost every year where anarchy has broken out, and freedom as a result has collapsed. You cannot walk down the street safely without fear of being shot or blown up or whatever. Freedom is a moral concept. It exists within a moral framework. You remove that framework, you don't experience more freedom, you actually experience less. Which is why the day after the American Declaration of Independence was signed, which clearly was a rather sad document, depending on which side of the equation you're coming from, one of the signatures to that declaration wrote, "Once a nation is equally poised, a nation must either preserve its virtue or lose its liberty. Once a nation is equally poised, you must either preserve your virtue or lose your liberty." In other words, if we lose that framework that binds and holds us together, this whole thing could simply result in collapse into tyranny. And this is exactly the biblical narrative. And if you want to read it, you'll actually read it through the book of Genesis, in the very first book of the Bible. A loving God wants to create a loving world. He gives it all of the conditions and everything it needs in order to experience and express love. But the story starts to go wrong fairly quickly, which is, it starts off by, instead of us embracing all of this and understanding how precious it is, we want to reject it and we want to go against it. In other words, we want to try and break God's moral law. And in one sense, it is impossible to break God's moral law. Breaking God's moral law is a bit like trying to break the law of gravity. If you want to break the law of gravity and you climb to the top of this building and you put a red cape around your neck, you put a big S on your chest and a pair of bright red underpants outside everything else you're wearing, and you throw yourself from the top of this building to break the law of gravity, what will you break? You will break yourself while proving the law in the process. And in that sense, it is entirely impossible to break God's moral law. You simply end up breaking yourself while proving his law in the process. And at this point, we very often misread things that we see in the Bible because so much of what we read is so tone-dependent. So let me read you a passage from the Bible. This is from the book of Isaiah. It's in the very first chapter of it. And as you listen to this, I'd like you to imagine, what kind of voice do you think this should be read with? You know, if you were asked to read this publicly, okay, this is God speaking to his people, what kind of tone would you put in? Is he angry? Is he mad? Is he frustrated? What is the tone you would put in? Because tone makes all the difference to meaning. If you walk up to him at the end and say, "Hi, Michael, it's nice to see you," and I say, "Hi," that's different from me going, "Hi." Okay, the word is the same, but tone actually makes rather a big difference to what I actually intend by it. But this is from Isaiah 1. This is what it says. "Woe to the sinful nation, a people whose guilt is great, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord. They've spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him. Why would you be beaten anymore? Why persist in rebellion? Your whole head is injured. Your whole heart is afflicted. From the sole of your foot to the top of your head, there is no wholeness, only wounds and welts and open sores, not cleansed or bandaged or soothed with oil." Now, what did you just hear? Anger? Frustration, condemnation. Have you ever noticed that sometimes parents ask their children stupid questions? Have you ever noticed that? Like, "Do you want to smack?" As if any thoughtful child would go, that's interesting. Yeah, 2. I need 2 because I'm being naughty now, but I'm going to do some stuff a bit later, and so I'll take that one in advance, and then we've got it over and done with. Now, in the middle of this reading, I don't know if you noticed it, there appear to be some foolish questions. Should you be beaten anymore? Why persist in your rebellion? But actually, these questions aren't foolish at all. What God is saying is, look, every time you try to break my law, you're breaking yourself while proving it in the process. Look, has anyone ever lied to you? Have you ever been betrayed by a friend? Has anyone ever stolen from you or misled you? Did it hurt? Every single time we go against what he wants, we get hurt. And God is not speaking with frustration here. He is pleading with his people. He says, why do you want to be beaten again? Why do you want to persist in this rebellion? Look at what's happening to you. Look at what's happening to you. You are so damaged and broken right now. Why keep doing that? Look at what's happening around your neighbors. Look at all the pain they're going through. Why would you want to continue with that? Look at your city. Look at your nation. Look at the world and your relationship with other nations. Can you not see all of this that you're doing is hurting? Why keep going that way? This is not a stupid question. This is actually very profound. Which is why a little bit later in Isaiah chapter 1 in verse 18, God says, "Come now, let us reason together. Though your sins be like scarlet, though your rebellion against me literally runs like blood, we can make it white as snow. Let us find a way to reconcile and bring all of this back together." The tone in this passage isn't one of frustration or anger. It's one of someone pleading. Just take a moment. Think about what you're doing. Where is all of this going? So I said the biblical narrative is a loving God creates a loving world. He gives it all of the conditions and everything it needs to experience and express love. But instead of embracing him and what he gave us, we've broken his law and we lead broken lives. We are genuinely hurt in all kinds of ways. We see the suffering in the lives of other people. We see the suffering in ourselves. It's very often hard to talk about it. Have you noticed that? Have you ever seen someone fall in love with someone who you know is using them, for example, to go back to our previous example? You know they care desperately for this person. This other person's treating them like dirt. Everyone can see it apart from them. Have you ever had a friend go through that experience? Okay, feel free to be interactive and raise your hand. Have you ever tried talking to them? Put up your hand. Have you ever tried talking to a friend who you can see is just going down a disastrous course of action? You want to speak to them, right? Keep your hand in the air if the conversation went well. It's very hard, isn't it? Because all kinds of things kick in at that point, all kinds of defensiveness. No, you don't understand me. You don't know what it's like. It has to be like this. How can you possibly get this so wrong? You're coming with the best intention in the world to say, look, I think this person's actually doing something to you I don't want to see done. But it's so often, isn't it, when we're on the receiving end of that, just to push it away. But actually, that's exactly what's being described to us here. A loving God who actually loves us, who created this world for love, saying, look at the damage that's happening as you go your own way. The very things that make love possible and real are the very things that we can use to make things go so horribly wrong. And it's not just that we've broken his law and we have broken lives, but we live in a broken world. We see the effects of this around us all of the time. One of the hardest talks I was ever asked to give, I think, in the context of this university was at the Oxford Union shortly after the tsunami. I don't know if any of you can remember back that far. For me, everything is recent. I keep saying I recently spoke on that. But in this context, I think some of you would have been in primary school when those events took place, so you may not remember. But it was catastrophic. They asked if I would speak on something like God and the tsunami, and my initial response was to say, look, I'm not comfortable with the title because it sounds like we're trying to attract an audience off the back of a disaster where hundreds of thousands of people died. And I just don't know if that's the right thing to do. How about I just speak on God and suffering, and within the context, I promise I'll address that issue. And as we began to just look at all of that, I said, what I find very interesting is if I saw a world that was in contradiction to the Bible. In other words, if I saw a world where Jesus said, hey, the world looks like this, but actually it looked very different, I would have a king-size problem. Does that make sense? Jesus said the world looks like this, the world actually looks like that. If he's meant to be God, how can they be in contradiction? I have a problem. I said, but if I see a world which looks exactly as he described it to me, I don't sit around saying, gosh, I have a huge problem trying to reconcile these two. I now sit around saying, what does this mean? How do I understand that? In Luke 21, and there's a copy of the Gospel of Luke on your table called Uncover, and you can take it away if you don't have it. Please go and read it. You'll see Jesus Christ says there will come a time on earth when the nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the raging and the tossing of the sea. Now, it's normally captains of boats who live in perplexity and fear of the raging and tossing of the sea, but not nations in the plural. So when I see things happen in this world that Jesus Christ told me would happen, it doesn't allow me to doubt him. Rather, it does raise questions where I say, what does all of this actually mean? We live in a world where we are reaping the consequences of what we do and how we live. Actually, we won't have time to go into that. Let me skip over that. But not only have we broken his law, we live in broken lives, we live in a broken world, we also see this as broken God's heart. Also in the Gospel of Luke, if you read that account, you'll see Jesus at one point says, look, I long to gather you together in my embrace, like a hen gathers her chicks, but you're not willing to come to me. He says, but you don't come. There's another time where Jesus just simply breaks down in tears and cries. It's the shortest verse in the whole Bible. Jesus wept. We read that not only did all of this, a loving God create all of this, set it up for one way, but we're possible of taking it in a totally another way. We also read that this actually hurt God himself. Now, this raises a very important question, which I'm not going to have time to go into in great detail, which is, well, why bother then? If it's the case that for this kind of loving world that we have that seems so essential to meaningful existence, all these other things are also out there as well, then surely it's better not to create in the first place. Now, there are two challenges as soon as we raise that question. Whenever we compare one thing to another thing, we can do that. We need a standard by which to make the comparison, and we need two things to compare between. So if I were to say to you, hey, look, my Bentley is better than your Skoda, and I don't have a Bentley, but you can always live in hope, I suppose, of destroying the environment. So if I make that statement, well, we've got two states of existence to compare, and then I suppose I use some kind of criteria to decide between them. But how do you compare existence with non-existence? It's very complicated. And when you say it would be better for me not to exist, why is the non-existent you more happier and thinks it's a better state to be in than the existent you? So there is a problem we have even as we raise the question just at a basic linguistic level, but there's something else that's very important here, because the implication seems to be, well, God had to do this, and then it all went wrong, so let's blame him. But there's no need for God to actually create anything at all. That's the wrong question to ask. I said earlier that love is a relational quality. It only exists between personal beings. When my first daughter was born, because people knew I loved books, everyone gave her books. And one of the books I got given was actually written by a Christian, and it was called Someone to Love. And it basically said, There was this God, he was all alone, he wanted someone to love, he created a beautiful blue and green planet, he put people on it, and now he finally had someone to love. Now, this book was not laid aside lightly, it was thrown with great force, and it went straight into the bin. Because whatever narrative that is, that's not a Christian narrative. It may be true in other systems that God needs to create life in order to experience love, because love is a quality that exists between personal beings, but the God of the Bible is actually Trinitarian. 3 persons in one Godhead. God exists in a set of living, loving relationships. He doesn't need to create life in order to express and experience love. He is love in his very nature, and out of that he creates life. So there is no need. As a matter of fact, it's even more profound than that, because we're actually told that even before God laid the foundations of the world, he knew what it was going to cost him to put this world right. There's a rather incredible verse in the book of Revelation that says, before the foundations of the world were laid, before even principles were put into effect that would actually make creation possible, God knew what it would cost him in order to rescue it. He knew it would go wrong, and he knew what it would cost. And that price he was prepared to pay was not a small one. Now, the way we determine in economics about how valuable something is to you is the price you're prepared to pay for it. Okay, so this is my wedding ring. It's gold, or at least that's what the person who sold it to me said it was. Someone said it's a small band of metal that cuts off your circulation. Now, this has value, but not because it's rare. This has value because someone's prepared to pay for it in economics. If nobody wanted gold, if no one was prepared to pay for it, the value of this would be, well, 0. Nobody wants it. There's no demand, quite literally. So it has no value. We determine economic value by the price we're prepared to pay for something. And we see something about the value that God was prepared to pay for us, because the price he was prepared to pay to rescue us out of this state we find ourselves in was the highest possible price he could have paid. Even before God created this world, he did know it would go wrong. And he knew what it would take to put it right. He himself came into this world in the person of Jesus Christ, and he took on into his body everything that's gone wrong in ours. All the wrong things we've done, all the bad things that we've said or committed, all of the consequences that flow from that, all of that he took on into himself. He was willing to give himself up to death on the cross. So even though we may have broken his law and we live broken lives and we live in a broken world, on the night that Jesus Christ was betrayed, he took a loaf of bread, held it in front of a group of people and said, "This is my body broken for you." And he took on the consequences of the brokenness of this world into himself and laid down his life. If God exists, do you think gold means anything to him? The price that God was prepared to pay to rescue us was the highest possible price he could have paid. There is nothing greater or bigger he could have given than to get us out of the mess we find ourselves in. He himself literally is willing to pay that price. And the consequences that he then invites us into relationship with him. This is what it says elsewhere in the Bible. It says, "This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. And this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son into this world as a sacrifice for our sin." That's why elsewhere in the Bible we talk about the fact that if you actually turn to Christ, there is this living hope that you can actually receive from him. I started off by saying that we live in a world where basically all of our relationships are morally conditioned, because they are. Every friendship we have represents a group of people that we can morally trust. Every relationship we have where there's deep love is reflected in commitment. And what we read in the Bible is Jesus Christ is committed to us to the point where he's willing to lay down his life to take on to himself what we ourselves have done wrong, where he's willing to be broken on our behalf. And he comes to us and he offers us the possibility of a new beginning with him. The way you forgive, you receive forgiveness if you have morally offended or done something wrong to someone else is very simple. You say, "I'm sorry." And then if the party's willing to forgive you, you at that point receive their forgiveness into your life. And it's amazing. I don't know if you've ever offended someone, apologized, and they've forgiven you. It's amazing. The next time you walk into a room, even if they're like 20 meters away, you can look at them for 1 nanosecond and know if you've been forgiven. Have you ever had that experience? It's incredible. If they haven't forgiven you, you can walk into the same room the next day, look at them 20 meters away, and know that there's still a problem. And this loving God who created this loving world longs to have a relationship with us. He paid the price. He's made it possible. He knew what was coming. And he even offers us forgiveness as a gift and says, if you're willing to say sorry for the part you've played in this, I will forgive you. And we look forward to a time when there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and God will literally bring about a new world for us to live in. Why continue in our rebellion? Why persist? Well, this is why the idea of repentance and faith is right at the very center of the Christian faith. All of us have done things wrong. All of us. We've all failed in our life, without exception. If you're sat here today and you believe you're perfect, the only way out of that state of self-deception is to get married. All of us. God loves this world. He created it. He put it here. He made love possible. Even though we have broken that, all of the conditions and rules that make that love possible, he came into this world and was broken for us. He offers us forgiveness as a gift. He's willing to forgive. And the way you receive anyone's forgiveness, whether it's divine or human, is simply by saying sorry. And when you do, 2 things happen. You know the peace of release from the things you've done wrong, and you suddenly now find yourself in a relationship that is utterly amazing. And that's what's on offer here.